Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Theological Leftovers. We have received a question that we want to try to answer, and I'll talk about the specific topic in just a moment. But to set us up for it, because it is kind of a confusing one, it's a controversial issue sometimes. At least when we get to that part in the Bible and a Bible study, it usually sparks quite a bit of conversation. And so I think a good way to start is with an illustration, even before you know what I'm talking about. And I think it'll make things simpler. So I need you to imagine something. I want you to imagine that I'm a member of a congregation and I and my family are getting ready to go to church on Sunday. And before we go, in preparation, I do a couple of things. I get ready like I normally would. I'm trying I'm putting a little more work into my appearance than I normally would for church. I slap on some cologne and I put on, honestly, I'm not really dressed for church. I'm more dressed like I'm getting ready to go out to the club or on a date. And so I'm looking my best. All right. And then right before we leave, I take this, I take it. Well, imagine that it's not coming off. Imagine that I take it off and I put it on my dresser and we go out the door. In fact, let's just say we don't even drive together. My wife and the kids drive and I drive separate. And then when we get to church, we don't sit in the same place. My wife and the kids sit over here and I sit over there next to a very nice looking young lady. And then after church, kids and wife go home. I go out to eat with the lady. You think that would cause a stir in the church and in my family? How do you think that would go over? Would all of those actions seem to be indicating something, right? Those choices that I made, like trying to take off, hey, wait, there goes, taking off the ring, does that indicate something? The ring indicates something, that I'm married. So does taking it off before I go to a public place to hang out with somebody other than my wife of the opposite sex, does that indicate anything? Would you have a problem with that behavior? Well, if you have a problem with that because of what it indicates, then you really don't have a problem with what Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when he talks about women wearing coverings on their head. Now, understand, I am not telling you that women need to wear coverings on their head. That's not the main point of the text. Just like this is a symbol of my commitment, lifelong commitment to one woman, my wife, Amy, right? That's what this is. This is this isn't the marriage. This is just a symbol of the marriage, right? Of our relationship and of the commitment that I made to her. And it's not a vague commitment, just that we'll live in the same house, but the commitment is very specific. We made vows to one another. I would do certain things. She would do certain things. And this is a reminder of those vows, right? And to remove this is to call into question, is he going to keep those vows, right? So it's an important symbol, but it is just a symbol. And the same is true for the head coverings that are talked about in 1 Corinthians 11. The head coverings upon women indicated something, the same sort of thing that's indicated by a wedding ring. But what Paul is talking about is the relationship between a husband and a wife and their public confession of a commitment that they made to one another. He's talking about the important connection between marriage and faith. And he's talking about the great gift of a couple praying together. Not just each individual praying, not having their own spiritual lives, but their spiritual lives, just like every other part of their life, are intimately entwined together. And so this has something to do, in other words, marriage has something to do with my spiritual life and my wife's spiritual life. We no longer have just we no longer have two separate spiritual lives. We have one spiritual life. And my wife has a role in that, and I, as her husband, have a role in that. And as parents, we have a role in that with our children, and they have a role as well. We're talking about Christian vocation, and this reflects that. This reflects the Christian vocation. Now, with the women, they were expected to have their heads covered when they prayed, and with the men, their heads were not covered. And this has to do with God's order of creation, the specific role that the husband has as the head of the household, and the role that the woman has that is submissive. And this reflects the relationship that we, the church, have with Christ. And so what Paul is doing here is he's not only emphasizing the importance of marriage and keeping that marital covenant, but he's also pointing out the relationship that healthy marriages have to a healthy congregation. Because ultimately in 1 Corinthians, what Paul is talking about more than anything else is the problem of divisions that have occurred in the church. And he's making a direct connection between divisions in the family and the impact that that's had in the life together of the fellow Christians, right? What happens in your home, what happens between husband and wife has an impact on their congregation and their congregational life. In fact, the same could be true in terms of the civil world. If you want a healthy civilization, a healthy culture, you're not going to have it if you don't have healthy marriages and healthy families. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why our founding fathers recognized the value of the church, because they recognized that fact, that there's nothing that they could do to create a healthy culture if they didn't have healthy families. And healthy families are something that healthy families are supported by congregational life. Healthy families are something that comes out of the Christian faith, right? Just like good works come out of faith in Christ. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, but I want you to understand, women do not have to come to church with their heads covered, which I suppose also means, and this is going to be controversial, but I suppose that also means men do not have to come to church with their heads uncovered, because that symbol doesn't mean what it used to mean. Now we use things like this to talk about our relationship, to publicly confess our relationship, our marital relationship, and our covenant. Having said that, I think you need to go out of your way. We need to go out of our way not to cause offense. Again, we don't want to take the orderly and make it disorderly, especially in the worship service. And so I'd be very careful bucking the trends just because you can. That's not what we use Christian freedom for. We use Christian freedom to love our neighbor. The reason this comes up is because someone had noticed via social media that within our own Lutheran circles that the head covering thing has started to reappear among some Lutheran women. I personally haven't seen that. It hasn't been a part of our life together here at Concordia, but apparently it's popped up. And in terms of my opinion on that, I don't really have an opinion if it's just a fashion statement. If it becomes a statement, if it becomes something that is a law, I don't want to say this. We don't want to become legalistic about something that is not necessary. But I think I even want to go a step further. And this is just my opinion too. I want to caution people, congregations and individuals. I want to caution them when it comes to trying to create or establish new traditions. And I am as guilty of this as the next person. Ritual is a very important thing, but be careful trying to establish new ones, and be careful when you're trying to bring back ancient ones or old ones. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but I'm saying move cautiously and move slowly. And quite honestly, before you try to introduce something new or restore something old, really seriously, I don't want to say this, question, is it worth it? What's the value of this? how is this pointing people to Jesus? Now, in this example, the head coverings and the lack of the women and the lack of wearing something on the head of the men pointed to God's created order, the particular vocations, the relationship between God and his son, the relationship between um, Jesus and his church. All these things were symbolized and demonstrated in the covering or the lack of covering of the head. I seriously question whether or not it's worth all of the teaching and the reintroducing in order to bring that back. We definitely do need to emphasize that marriage is between one man and one woman, and it's a lifelong commitment. We definitely need to emphasize that what God has called the husband to do is different than what he's called the wife to do. And there are multiple places, including Ephesians chapter 5, that talk about that. The roles are not interchangeable, just like father and mothers. The roles are not interchangeable. God has called you, God created you to be husband or wife, to be male or female, to be parent or child, and these are institutions given by God, and he's given us specific roles within those institutions. He's given us callings, vocations. So those are things that need to be understood. Those are things that need to be taught. Symbols can be a helpful way of doing that. What we practice, we want to make sure that whatever practices we establish are firmly based on the Word of God and point to the cross of Jesus Christ, the gospel. So again, I'm not saying it's wrong to do it, but it seems like something that's not going to be understood by our culture, no matter how much we teach it. And I'm not sure it's the best direction to go. And it's certainly not necessary. And I think that's the best I have when it comes to this as a potential new movement to try to teach something. I would also say this: I think the teaching needs to precede the practice. For example, we recently, well, not recently, a little over a year ago, maybe two, started practicing communion every Sunday. That's something that we talked about. The Lord's Supper was something that was included in every sermon for 15 years or more. It was a regular conversation in our Bible classes. The teaching preceded the change in practice. And even then, after over 15 years, there's been some debate about it. No huge controversies that I'm aware of, but the teaching needs to prefer. You shouldn't try to teach by introducing a practice that no one understands. You should teach first. And if that teaching leads to that practice, it reintroduces something that's old, that could be a good thing, I suppose. But I think when you start with the practice instead of the teaching, there's no telling what people are going to actually learn. Does that make sense? And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, what the people need to learn is what marriage is and the relationship between husband and wife, what that is according to God's institution, and then also the relationship between family and our life together as Christians. The impact that a broken family has on a congregation is profound. And so, talking about our worship life and our married life and the relationship between those two things, I think this is the main thing that Paul is talking about. When you read this text, you'll see it, especially as you look at the greater context, because he addresses all kinds of issues. And all these issues are surrounding one main problem in the church in Corinth, and that is they're divided. They're terribly divided. And so, as you think about reintroducing ancient practices, make sure that your goal is concord and not division, or you're totally missing the point of this book, 1 Corinthians. I hope that's helpful. A little bit different sort of topic, but I appreciate this is what 3 in a row, and I actually just got a fourth today. So that's like 4 questions in maybe a month, which is great for me. So again, if you have questions about this or you have other topics that you'd like me to discuss, um, I'll do my best with them. Otherwise, I'll just keep coming up with stuff that I'm interested in. And hopefully you'll find it interesting too. God bless you all. God bless your week. This weekend, if you're in the Evansville area, 9 o'clock, we're still studying Revelation. Oh my goodness, what a great study we had this past Sunday. Just covered 5 verses, but it was outstanding. And so we're going to continue that at 9 o'clock on Sundays, and then 10:30 is when our worship service begins. We hope that we will see some of you there. God bless you all.